Welcome. I'm Vanessa Murphy, investigative reporter at 8 News Now, also known as KLAS TV in Las Vegas. We have part 2 of our interview with Chief Investigative Reporter George Knapp here.
Hey, Vanessa.
Thanks for part 2 here.
Nice to see you.
So we can talk about why we have part 2, because part 1, we just kept talking about UFOs,
That
and I
happens a
feel
lot.
like we barely scratched the surface even.
Yeah, that was a condensed version for sure. Yeah.
So I really want to talk about your career and your work in Las Vegas, but there was also just some big news about a movie. I know you can't say a lot, but what can you say?
Well, the information that's out there, I don't think that the director wanted it out. It got out, so he added some other details, but most of the details about the project are not out yet. I've been asked not to talk about it. You can read into that what you want to. I'm excited about it, of course, and it sounds like a movie I'd go see.
And essentially a movie based on your life, in a way, and
Yeah.
your work.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I can confirm that, yeah.
Okay, so if you had to pick a couple of people to play you.
I told them the age regression of Jack Nicholson would be
Okay.
great. That didn't go over too well. So there are a lot of names in the mix, a lot of really impressive names that have been tossed around. I don't know where that sits right now, but I think I got a feeling that when they make a formal announcement about it, people are going to be pretty excited, as I am and was.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Bradley Cooper, where are you? All right. So, George, let's start just with your work in Las Vegas. How did you start reporting?
I was a teacher. I taught at University of the Pacific as a grad student. I became their director of forensics. I ran their debate program. I thought I was going to have a career in academia. I had an offer to go to a Pac-10 university and start their debate program, and I was tired of it. I was tired of being poor, for one thing. Little did I know how poor I would be by working in television. So I had been the debate coach at UC Berkeley for a year, and I'm looking around trying to figure out what to do. And I met this group of guys from Las Vegas. They were bartenders, the craziest, wildest people I'd ever known. And I was trying to decide what to do, and they had told me, we know a guy in television in Las Vegas. I'll bet he can help you get started. You can write and you can speak and you could be on TV. So, yeah, okay. Maybe I'll do that. And I had maybe $600 saved, a really crummy car, and I had a significant other at the time. I wanted to move to Hawaii. She wanted to go to Las Vegas. We flipped a coin, and it came up Las Vegas. So these bartenders introduced a guy who he was sort of a mob guy. He was a bartender that I met at a mob-owned joint. And I went to see him when we first got to town. I said, I'm going to try to break into television. He says, well, you need a job in between. Can you drive a taxi? I said, I can drive. Look, I've only been here 2 days. I don't know where anything is. He says, pay that guy at the end of the bar $300, and you can drive a taxi. And so I gave him half of my stash, and he sent me to this taxi company that no longer exists. They said, okay, well, you can start tomorrow, but you got to go get a taxi license. I went down to the Nevada Taxi Cab Authority. They give you a little test back then. How do you get from the airport to the Showboat Hotel? I flunked all of them. I flunked every single question. The lady looks at it, goes in the back room, comes back out, goes, stamps his thing. Okay, pose for a picture. You got a taxi license. And I was the worst taxi driver in the world, but it helped me sort of learn my way around town. It was a comedy of errors how bad I was at it. And at the same time, I was going over to meet this TV guy who was a production supervisor at KLVX, the PBS station. Nice guy. Not exactly a powerhouse in the TV industry who can usher me right into stardom. But I kept going over to see him. I put in an application. I'd keep pestering them. And eventually they hired me as a part-time production assistant. And Channel 10 was moving studios at the time. So I would do a lot of lifting boxes and bricks and mixing cement and also as a studio cameraman. And every day I was doing that for months. I would go into the news department and read through what was their morgue file, they called it, which were these news clippings of what was going on in town. A lot of it was mob stuff. And it just so happened that these mob guys that were in these stories in the morgue file were people I knew. The first people I met as a taxi driver, I'd go to this one particular nightclub after I'd get off work. And there are all these names from the news. I mean, Lefty Rosenthal, Joey Cusimano, Spilatro showed up there a couple of times. I got to meet Freddie Glussman, who was the owner of this place called the Oz, and a lot of these characters who were in the news a lot. So that was a good leg up for me further down the road when I finally got to Channel 8. I was there. I pestered them so much that they finally said, fine, here's a camera, go shoot this story and leave us alone. And so I went out with a camera, shot a story, brought it back, wrote it, and then let me do other stories. And then about 6 months, after 6 months of that, the anchor band they had two weekly newscasts. The anchor band left, quit, and they had open auditions for the anchor. I figured, well, how hard can this be? So I didn't even own a suit. So I applied for it and got it. And I did that for a year, and I came to the attention of Bob Stoddall and Ned Day, and they hired me away. And as a general assignment reporter, I started here, and I was way over my head. In those days, the reporters had to edit their own stories. They asked me, "Do you know how to edit?" Oh yeah, I know how to edit. I didn't know how to edit, and they found that out pretty quickly. But they were very patient with me. They saw something, and they allowed me to grow and make mistakes and learn the job and learn the town, and it blossomed.
And talking about when you become a cab driver, there's no Waze, there's no Apple Maps. When you're editing, there's no click with a mouse. It is probably tape to tape or? I'm
trying to, yeah, in those days, sure. I tell you, when I started the cab driver thing, I knew where the airport was and I knew where the Strip was. And I figured, look, they're all going to go to the Strip. I'll just go from the airport and I'll look for whatever hotel they're going to. And I think the first ride I took was to the Las Vegas Hilton, which is over there on Paradise. I start heading up to the Strip, and the clients, passengers, say, "Hey, isn't that the Hilton over there?" So there were a lot of adventures like that. Yeah, it was a much different town back in those days, smaller, of course, but I didn't know my way around at all.
Now, when you talk about these mobsters, what exactly were they doing? I feel like it's a silly question, but can you just sort of break it down?
Well, it was like the beginning of the end. When I got here, 1979, gaming control and the FBI had stepped up the heat on them, but the mob guys were here because there was cash here. And the Teamster loans had been used with mob influence to finance expansion or construction of almost every hotel property on the Strip, all of them. And all those loans came with strings attached, which meant skimming. That's people inside the hotel would have to look the other way as the mobsters who had inside contacts would take money out the back door, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And all that went back to Chicago, with the Chicago outfit, which was sort of the overseer of Las Vegas, but they had subsidiaries in Kansas City and Milwaukee, and those smaller mob families, they had people here everywhere. So there were people who were inside hotels that orchestrated the skim, seemingly respectable people, and some like Lefty Rosenthal who were not respectable at all. And then there were outside people, Tony Spilatro and his crew. They were sent here by the Chicago outfit to protect the skim, protect the flow of information that went back to the bosses in Chicago. After a while, Spilatro and his crew got restless. He brought in some real tough people, killers, burglars, thieves. They imposed street taxes on bookies and loan sharks. They put taxes on drug dealers and folks like that. They started their own burglary ring, high-end burglary ring called the Hole in the Wall Gang. They would drill holes in walls or in ceilings and go in and rob places. I mean, it was the Wild West. The FBI, which had always been regarded as sort of an invading force by Las Vegas, as the bad guys, sent a guy named Joe Yablonsky, the king of Sting, into Las Vegas to clean it up. And there were a lot of clashes between the power structure that existed here and these outside interlopers who were trying to take down the mob. It was a fascinating time to be here, but it was the beginning of the end. Gaming control got into the act. Metro, which had some people inside Metro who were actually working with the mob back then. They rooted them out. They formed a coalition and went after these mob guys and started putting the pressure on, and eventually it got them. They kicked them all out of the gaming industry, and that allowed corporations, for better or worse, to come in and change the face of the industry and make it more respectable.
How much did they work with you or maybe feed you some stories? And were you ever nervous, like ethically, of who am I dealing with here?
Very much so, because there were we worked closely with the FBI in those days. Bob Stoddall, Ned Day in particular, would get information and put it to good use and put pressure on these guys. Ned, who also wrote for the Review Journal and previously the Valley Times, as a columnist, would just insult him and beg for trouble. Just beg for trouble. And the mob guys in those days generally saw reporters as non-combatants. You're doing your job. You show up at there was a perp walk or something like that, a gaming hearing, a trial of some sort almost every day. And everyone who worked here did mob stories to one degree or another. And Ned and Bob were the best in terms of overseeing all of it. I would talk to those mob guys just to get their take of it. They wouldn't go on camera. They weren't feeding me information that I then put on the air unfiltered. But it was good to be able to talk to them and get their side of things. And we weren't exactly sympathetic to them, but it allowed us to be closer to the middle, not just tools of the FBI and trying to take them down.
Ned Day. I know recently you posted, I believe, his grave, right? You still visit.
Yeah, I go there every year on his birthday.
What happened?
Well, Ned, Ned invited trouble. He begged for it. He would belittle them, call them names. He was just taunting them. I remember a couple of times he'd go on vacation, which he didn't want to take vacations, and he'd go to mob joints in other cities and pester them. San Diego, and so. He was the one exception to the rule of journalists being non-combatants. They wished him ill. I remember going out one night with him. We were young single men, and we availed ourselves of what was out there in Las Vegas,
which we will revisit.
We would go out. I remember going to this really hot nightclub in town with Ned, and as we're going in the doorman, this hulking guy, I'll tell you what his name is in a minute, pulls us aside, and he showed us a little wanted poster that someone had made up with Ned's face on it. Basically, if you see this guy, do him harm. The guy who was the doorman, his name's Steve Sharippa, who was, you might know him as Bobby Bacalari from The Sopranos. He went on to become an actor.
Goodness.
Yeah. So it was, Ned was cautious in those days. I remember after Tony Spilotro died, a horrible death, by the way, Ned wrote a column, and it was not apologetic at all. It eviscerated Spilotro all over again. And the next night is when his car was blown up. And, that was the best day in Ned's life. His car was firebombed. The only bad part was his favorite golf clubs were in the back. But he didn't own a car. He didn't own a house. He didn't own anything. It had been leased for him. But people started having these bumper stickers. This is not Ned Day's car. After that, Ned did some interviews. He was really thrilled that he had got under their skin so much that they'd firebomb his car.
So more like a badge of honor.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
When there were a lot of mob-related people who got killed, people who just knew them, there were a lot of murders. I recall being. It was a night when I was first here, before I was at Channel 8. I went over to get some food at a place called My Place on Maryland Parkway. It was a mob place. Frank Collada was the one that had the. There was a restaurant and a bar right next to each other. Frank Collada was running the restaurant, and he was a hitman and a burglar. I stopped in the front of that as we're walking in the restaurant. There's Joey Guzmano sitting out in front, and there's Tony Spilotro. And that was the first time I met him. Joey introduces me to him. Hey, how you doing? And I'd see him later. And we said hello, went inside, got some food, and left. Now, Spilotro was always under police surveillance in those days. So as there was a couple of cops out there watching that interaction with us. Half an hour later, another guy pulls up, does the same thing, says hello, shakes hands, goes in, gets some food, and leaves. And the cops didn't know who he was. They thought he was a mob guy. So they followed him. His name was Frank Bluestein. Bluestein. They followed him home, and there was an incident that happened. Supposedly, he got out of his car carrying a hero sandwich, and they thought it was a gun. He got shot and killed 8 or 9 times.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, those were dicey times. We look back on it sort of with nostalgia now, but people were being killed. There were a lot of murders and bodies that appeared in the desert, and it was a dangerous time because it was like an exorcism of the mob. And Ned was right there leading the charge on all of it, and Bob Stoddall as well. So we had to be careful, but in general, as I said, we were non-combatants, but there were exceptions. And so Ned, after Spilatro's death and the firebombing, he cleans up his act. He stops drinking. He goes on a diet. He made it a 5-part series on the air about he was going to clean up his act. He still smoked a lot. He fell in love, meets this girl, this woman on a golf course. They go to Hawaii and have this great vacation. And in the last column he wrote, it was kind of prophetic. It had a line that was essentially, hey, if I end up sleeping with the fishes, that is the preamble to it, which proved amazingly prophetic because he died there. He died in Hanauma Bay snorkeling, which if you knew Ned, the idea of him snorkeling at all seems ridiculous. Right? So that news hit Las Vegas like a tidal wave, and the station in particular. And so they sent me over to myself and Bryant Blackburn over to see what happened. See what happened, because there were already mob guys calling and saying, taking credit for it as if they bumped him off. So Bryant and I retraced Ned's steps. We figured out where he had gone for the whole trip, where he had dinner, what he was doing the last day. We found the lifeguards on the beach where he had been pulled out of the water. We talked to the paramedics who had taken him to the hospital. We talked to the doctors at the hospital, and then we talked to the coroner. They wouldn't allow us to see his body, but we did escort. We escorted it back. It was in the plane when we came back. And I know that there's always going to be some tiny little bit of doubt that how he died, but he had a heart attack. His dad had heart problems. Ned had a history of heart problems. And I think maybe the shock from quitting drinking is what led to an abrupt reaction by his body. He died. And and in the years since, people have called and taken credit for, I bumped off Ned, I can get you too, that kind of stuff, it was just a bunch of baloney.
So you're 100% sure he was not murdered?
99, yeah.
Pretty sure.
Yeah.
All right, you mentioned some partying back in the day. Can you tell us maybe about a wild moment during that time? One that won't get you in trouble now.
Sometimes we'd do wholesome things, like we'd get a houseboat every summer and go out to Lake Mead and just a raucous celebration for a couple of days. Channel 8 crew and some other people that we would know. And he finally talked Ned into going out there. We'd drink and do dangerous stuff, and Ned came out there, and I remember us we had this habit of getting ski ropes and just towing people behind the houseboat, and Ned went down like a rock. I think it looked like he was going to be drowned. We had to pull him out and resuscitate him and send him home.
Wow.
But he and I would go out. He didn't have family here. He had friends, of course, but it always seemed to end up that it was always holidays when he actually felt lonely, that I ended up going out with him on holidays or spending time with him, and go out and drink, chase women, get in trouble, look for mob guys, that kind of stuff. It was, we were young, we're on TV, we're well known, we're making a decent living, so yeah, and we were both single at the time, so yeah, I had a hell of a good time with Ned.
So is Las Vegas better now or better then?
Well, it depends on what the scale is, I certainly think back on those times with very fond memories. It was a smaller town. The old cliche about things were better when the mob ran it is sort of right, only in the sense of it was smaller, friendlier. There weren't so many bean counters in charge of the hotels. You didn't have to pay $35 to park somewhere at a hotel. It was, and if you're on TV and everybody watched TV, they knew you. So everybody knew us. There was no internet, there were no X or Twitter or anything like that. Everybody watched the newscasts, and Channel 8 at that time was dominant. When I was hired in 1981, Bob Stoddall, the newscasts in the evening had a 50 share. 50. You can't even imagine that now. And after the news, there was a PM magazine show that also had a 50 share. It was like the number one rated PM magazine show in the country. And so we were dominant. Now, eventually, the other stations, 3 and 13, got better. And then Channel 5 came along and had a good news news product and still does. And, it's better to have competition in that regard.
Right.
But I greatly appreciated the power that Channel 8 had, because if somebody wanted to break a story, we're the people they came to back then. The town itself, it's grown so much. Growth is something we could talk about maybe today, but because it was kind of fun. In those days, Las Vegas had a chip on its shoulder. Any national politician or showbiz personality, The Tonight Show, any of those kind of things that made jokes at Las Vegas's expense, it was umbrage, civic umbrage. We'd get hey, we're a real city is what we wanted to say. We're a real city. We have regular people here. Not everyone works in casinos. We don't live in casinos.
Right.
So it was kind of a cool era of the birth of civic pride in Las Vegas, kind of a thing. And I don't know if that exists. We're so big now, and people don't know each other as much as they did back then. And I would say that it was better back then. But the idea that things were better when the mob ran the town is not true, because the mob didn't run the town. They had interest in casinos. If anybody ran the town back in those days, it was Ralph Lamb, the sheriff.
And you knew him well.
Very well, yeah. I spent the last 3 years of Ralph Lamb's life working with him, interviewing him for dozens and dozens of hours about the amazing life that he'd led and what it was like back then. We kind of danced around some of the trouble spots in his career, because people who knew Ralph would say he had one foot in both camps. He was a no-nonsense lawman who settled problems with his fists. He would sometimes go beat people up, kick them out of town. Johnny Roselli, the mob ambassador who represented Chicago interests and L.A. interests, came here without checking in with the sheriff. He was sitting at the Desert Inn with, I think, the owner of the DI, maybe with Mo Dalitz and Hank Greenspun, and Ralph walked in there. He sent a deputy in first who gave him the brush off, and then walked in and grabbed Johnny Roselli by the tie, dragged him across the table, and threw him in a paddy wagon and shipped him down to the jail. And he took special pleasure in, we stripped him of his $1,000 suit and put him in an orange jumpsuit. But before we did that, we gave him a delousing process. So he was letting Roselli and the mob know who was the boss in this town.
Yeah, I don't think I see anything better about that approach than now.
Yeah, he did all kinds of stuff he admits he couldn't get away with now, sure. But he was the boss.
I do think that there is still somewhat of civic pride in Las Vegas, though, because you remember the battle sort of with San Francisco about the baseball team, and there was some sensitivity there, or even like Green Day's front man had something negative to say, and people did kind of get upset.
Yeah. I remember there was a show that 48 Hours did about Las Vegas, and it was really kind of a slight. It was kind of a snarky show. There was also a time when Johnny Carson made some kind of a wisecrack about maybe it was UNLV or something, or Las Vegas. Anyway, governor at the time, Dick Bryan, went on a tirade. How dare you, Johnny Carson? You need to apologize. And then that was a bad thing, because Johnny Carson comes back with a segment called Lighten Up Dick, in which he just ripped Governor Bryan in Las Vegas, and they had Charlton Heston making fun of UNLV as an academic institution.
Yeah.
And it was crazy.
I said San Francisco. I mean Oakland.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. Well, I can understand Oakland being mad at us.
Looking at your career from start to now, what would you say that you're most proud of as far as a single story or series of stories?
Two things. So one would be animal welfare stuff. I know people think of me as the UFO guy, but I've done more stories about animal welfare, animal abuse, than anything else since I've been here. And it's taken a lot of different forms. I think the first month I was here, somebody shot an arrow into a duck at a local golf course. It became Donna the Duck. There was a big effort to catch Donna the Duck for a couple of days, and I made a lot of duck kind of puns and things and had some fun with it, but eventually she was rescued, and it put me in contact with some really big-hearted animal people who, when they started seeing an animal welfare issue, they started funneling stories to me. And so I did stories on lions, tigers, ligers, bears, dogs, cats, coyotes, wolves, cougars, all kinds of ducks and other birds, eagles, elephants, chimpanzees. I've done a lot of animal stories, and once in a while you can do something that really makes a difference. I'll tell you, until you've met an elephant, you don't get animal welfare issues. There was an elephant, a lady named Linda Faso had introduced me to, had been a circus performer, and we campaigned on that in essence. And these stories about the horror faced by these animals like big cats and elephants that travel with a circus, live their lives in these rail cars, and to their credit, Ringling Brothers eventually stopped that stuff. But they didn't do it easily. It took a lot of years of beating them over the head for how bad it was. But there was this one elephant that I got to know named Jenny, who she was in the circus, then she was out, she was released, and then the third time I met her was when she was taken to a sanctuary. So that's a pretty cool thing. Those are impressive animals. And then CJ, this chimpanzee, my wife and I got to know these two chimps. I was going to do a story about them. They were being shown at a local swap meet. I thought that's just really horrible for these baby chimps. And then we met the lady who had them, and she obviously loved them. She was taking care of them. She had raised them. They lived in her house with her. And so it softened the approach we had. But basically it was a story. It's not a good idea to have chimps as a pet.
Right.
Later, CJ and her sibling, Buddy, become these big animals, big, strong, dangerous animals. They broke out of this enclosure. I don't know if you remember the story, but they got out on the streets and the metro surrounded it. They had snipers. I'm thinking, gosh, I hope they can just, tranquilize them.
Yeah.
But Buddy got killed.
Oh, my goodness.
And then to CJ, some people came to the rescue for CJ and found a sanctuary willing to take her. We took that trip. And I remember it was like 6 or 7 days. Bill Rowe and I went, and it was just an amazing time to be there with that animal and get to know CJ a little bit. And she's still alive and still healthy. And I think she's being moved from that facility in Oregon. And I recall being on the state line. We didn't have permission to take her into Oregon. We were waiting for their governor or our governor to work something out. We said, to hell with it. We're just taking her, and crossed over.
And your work with wild horses.
Wild horses, sure. I've covered that for 35 years. And it doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican, no matter what party's in power in the White House and which president gets to appoint a BLM director, it's always the same. The horse has got to go. When that Wild Horse and Burro Act was passed with the efforts of Wild Horse Annie, a Nevada lady, and it went into Congress and it passed 100-0 in the Senate, 100-0. It was the most mail the Congress had received on any issue since the Vietnam War. That was the law of the land, and they set aside millions of acres that would be used for horse habitat. And now, basically, most of that has been zeroed out. They have 70,000 horses rounded up living in government pens. They keep paying these contractors to go out and inflict this horrible stuff on these herds, usually at the worst possible time, birthing, foaling season, and the dead of winter and the heat of summer. There is no concern whatsoever for those animals. They are literally the horse that we rode in on. They helped tame the West. And the law says that there's got to be a place for them. And every administration that I have seen since I've been following the story has tried to get rid of them, kill them, move them away, so that mining and agriculture and cattle ranching and stuff like that can take place on public lands instead of the horses.
But they won't say that.
No, but
they say that it's for the health of the land, right?
It's just bullshit. 60,000 horses are really bad for the public lands, but 2 million cattle are not. It's preposterous. They get blamed for all kinds of stuff. There have been a lot of studies paid for by our tax dollars that said they are not the ones causing the damage. And every time the horses get rounded up and kicked out and the cattle get to stay there.
Yeah. I wasn't aware of this until I started working with you, and when I moved to Nevada like more than a decade ago, and I started working on the stories thanks to you. But I think they say the horses need to be removed. There's a debate over that, but I think even if you agree they should be removed, which a lot of people don't, the way they try to round up the horses is really like the central issue of why do you need to chase them with a helicopter? Why are you still chasing a horse with a broken leg? I mean, seeing the video is like heartbreaking, and it's hard for us to get that video. Oftentimes we have to rely on these groups that somehow find a spot and get the footage.
They keep the public as far away from this as possible, literally and figuratively. For years, they would have this charade of public input into the roundups. Should we round up this herd up there in Mount Charleston? We want to hear from the public. And public would say, no, you shouldn't do it, and they'd completely ignore it. Now they don't even pretend to take that public input, and they don't care, and they keep observers as far away as possible. They keep the media away. It's for our own safety, of course, not because the public would be outraged if they could see what goes on out there. It's ridiculous, and it's not changing. Maybe it's going to get worse right now. I've been reading about the last couple of days what's likely to happen. Those 65, 70,000 horses that are in these government corrals, all ex-BLM people who own these ranches, and they get paid for each of the horses that stay there. I think they're going to probably ship them out to slaughterhouses.
So we discussed the animal stories and your passion for that. What do you think is the most wild story you've ever covered here? Non-UFO related.
Before we get to that, so you'd ask me which ones mean the most to me. The second one is water. So I got started on water a long time ago, and you can figure it out. You live in the desert, water's pretty key. And, if not for the Hoover Dam being and creating Lake Mead, I don't know what Las Vegas would be. We might have 10,000 people here. Las Vegas went through its groundwater pretty quickly and drained it. And so, water was the key to growth. And for the first 25 years I was here, Las Vegas was the fastest growing community city in the country. Just kept growing and growing and growing. And after a while, there's civic pride. Great, it's growing. The economy's jamming, and it's a lot of energy here. And but geez, along with growth comes a lot of problems. The schools are always overcrowded. You never enough money for education. Every street in the valley is torn up, and then it gets fixed, and then it gets torn up again. We're always behind on everything. That growth for its own sake is a stupid idea. You can't keep growing like this. I remember writing columns about it. Because the water officials would say, we have to keep growing. If we don't keep growing, it'll collapse. Yeah, that's a Ponzi scheme. That's what happens in a Ponzi scheme. What, are we going to keep growing out and build islands in the Pacific Ocean? Are we going to build platforms in space? It has to stop at some point, and it did in 2009. But along the way, so we started looking at water in a different kind of light, as the casino industry and the development industry, which are the two most powerful industries, in that they funded all the political campaigns. They're the primary source of money for every elected official in the state, basically, and they wanted to keep growing. So that came this idea, this ridiculous proposal to build a 300-mile-long pipeline up to rural Nevada and basically steal that water. Now, it's not their water, it's our water, but it would create a death zone, basically, because it would suck everything dry. Those little towns and little ranches, they could no longer exist if you take billions of gallons of groundwater up from under them to send it to Las Vegas so we can keep building swimming pools and fountains and stuff. So we started down that road and doing story after story. I don't know how many dozens of stories I did, but it kind of culminated with a show called Crossfire. We did an hour-long special that put all the evidence on the table. What hydrologists had been warning about, hey, if you build that, it will suck dry all these different aquifers and basins, and it will create a death zone. It will destroy communities. It will create an environmental dead zone, a terrible consequence. Water officials would overconfidently predict, oh, yeah, we can manage that. In a project that had never been done anywhere, it would have cost at least $5 billion, and it would have had terrible consequences. And I think that Crossfire, that show, we won a Peabody for it, which was a big surprise. No Nevadan had ever.
That's a huge honor in journalism for anyone who
It was really a surprise to us, but I think that helped blunt the impetus for that project. I'm not saying we killed it, because it's maybe still not dead, but we certainly put it in a different light than it had been presented, because it was being presented as, oh my God, this is life and death, as if, if we shut that project down, men and women and children would be crawling on their knees to go find water somewhere in a water hole. It was preposterous.
And what about your most wild story?
Most wild.
I mean, you've covered so much.
This was sort of, it's not really a mob story. It has mob intonations, but in the company of killers. So I did a couple of stories, after interviewing a lady named Wendy Hanley. Right before I got here, the Hanleys had a father and son hitman team. They were notorious in town. They did jobs for the mob. Mm-hmm. They did jobs for the unions. They did jobs for Betty Binion. They were tough. father and son team. I recall that homicide detective Dave Hatch had said he knew of 7 murders that they probably did. They also did a bunch of fire bombings. The culinary union was trying to unionize these restaurants who didn't want to be in culinary or have their employees there, and suddenly these restaurants started being blown up. These guys were doing it at the behest of this union leader named Al Bramlett. He was the most powerful labor leader in Nevada. And they kidnapped him and killed him and left his body with a hand sticking out of the ground.
Gosh.
It kicked off this search that went on for days. It was a huge story, huge. And eventually the body was found. Somebody ratted out the Hanleys, and they finally got some justice. But in the meantime, there was a third Hanley, Wendy Hanley, who had married this much older guy, Tom Hanley, and they were trying to bring her into the fold. They were trying to bring her into the family business. So they told her a lot of stuff that she probably shouldn't have known. And after those guys went to prison, she survived. And she shared that story with me about all that had happened there. And we made it into a special. That was pretty wild because she took me out to areas where she thought other bodies were. And that was a big one. And there was another one that took a long time to develop. It was Patrick McKenna. When I first got here in '79, I just missed it by a couple of months, but Patrick McKenna and 2 other inmates were the ringleaders of a siege at the city jail. They had taken it over. One of them had grabbed a gun from a corrections officer, took over the jail, and this thing was locked down and surrounded for days. It was national news as this siege was underway, and the negotiator chosen by the inmates was Bob Stoddall. So he's going back and forth between the cops and them. It ended in a bloody hail of bullets.
Oh my
A couple of the other 2 ringleaders were killed. McKenna was a really interesting character. He's thrown in the clink. Now he had been sent to a reform school at an early age to escape a brutal father, as a way to get him away from his father, who was a physical abuser. And he came out of that a hardened criminal and started doing jobs for unions, mobsters, anybody would pay, he and his gang. He ended up going to Nevada State Prison, or maximum security prison, at, I think, 18 years old, and escaped. And they put him back in, and he escaped again.
Oh, my goodness.
And then he did the jail thing. So Stoddall had talked to him back and forth. I think Mark Fierro, a reporter, had got an interview with him one time. I started writing to him in prison and sort of developing a relationship and see if he would trust me with things. And I saved all those letters. And over time, I wanted to go up and see him on death row. And I proposed to the governor and to the director of corrections, hey, can I spend a night on death row? Because they had built the Ely State Prison. It was a brand new death row. That'd be a pretty cool story to do if they'd let me. The governor said yes. The director of corrections said yes. The warden said yes. But then he said I'd have to get the okay from the inmates. Mm-hmm. And I wrote to him. And no one said no. Of the inmates who responded, none of them said no, except McKenna. And I'd been talking to him for a couple of years. What the hell is this? Why is this happening?
Games.
And I find out a couple of months later is that he had been in the process of planning an escape from death row.
Oh.
They had made heads that looked like right out of Escape from Alcatraz. They had wire cutters. They found a route out of the prison. They'd been tunneling up into this duct. And all they were waiting for is for it to snow so that when they get out, cut through the fence, the snow would cover their tracks and they could be gone. And if it had snowed before one of the partners in that had ratted out McKenna, he was gone. So that's why he wouldn't allow me to come up and spend the night on death row. So I did go up to see him months later, and it was a lot to get a camera on death row and to interview him, and they would lead him in. He was considered the emperor of death row. That was the name of the special we put together on him. And they have these giant, beefy guys. McKenna's just a little dude, but he was really smart. As a side story, his brother, who's a Reno attorney, went to law school so that he could defend Patrick. And he did. In the first case out of law school, he defended Patrick in a capital murder case. I think Patrick had 3 or 4. He had so many years stacked up, centuries, he would never get out. When they brought him back for his final hearing on death penalty and everything else in downtown courthouse, it was surrounded by SWAT. They had helicopters flying above. They had armed SWAT guys with automatic weapons in the courtroom, and they let him in like Hannibal Lecter on a gurney with a 50,000-volt stun gun around his chest and handcuffs and manacles, and it was quite a scene. He died like a year and a half ago, but it was interesting to know him. He was a smart guy, deadly but smart.
Wow, that's its own movie, George.
Yeah, I know.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I have a couple of questions I want to get to. What do you think about the state of journalism, particularly in Las Vegas?
Well, I can tell you what it's like here. I mean, Las Vegas is the best news town in America. Washington, D.C. is the only thing comes close because of money and power and celebrities and big events, big ideas. I mean, everybody comes here looking for a second chance, but it's also a magnet for the bank vice president who just absconded with the funds, or some scammer who's ripped off the elderly, and they come here and think they can blend in Las Vegas. Big mistake. You know, we've got a lot of cameras and things like that here. Fugitives get caught here all the time. It's hard to cover all that happens in Las Vegas anymore. Las Vegas, KLAS has always been at the forefront. We've sort of set the bar, not only for television, but I think the newspapers have learned a lot from us. Now they want to be TV stations as well. And now it's so thin. You know, the newsrooms are thin. People like you and David and Kyle on our team, I don't know how you do it. I mean, because you crank out investigative stories every day, you know, and we would, in the older days, we would at least have a couple of days to work on that. Now, I've had days where I've done as many as 7 stories, but mostly I was able to work on them longer. And I think the coverage in general outside of KLAS is so superficial. People don't go to gaming control board meetings anymore. I mean, reporters don't go there. There used to be radio reporters. It was not only TV and newspaper. All the local radio stations had their own news units, and sometimes it was just one person. But those reporters were good. They were feisty. They'd show up at news conferences and ask tough questions, and that's all gone. You know, that's been eliminated. A lot of cost cutting in TV, as we know. A lot of cost cutting in the newspapers. The RJ, I think, is a shadow of itself. The Sun was always a good, feisty, hard-hitting paper, and you know, it's not the same. We don't have the same depth of reporting that we used to have. And I don't want to be the old timer back in my day, you know, but you know, that's how I see it.
You're allowed to be that way, George.
Yeah, right.
Final question for you. What would someone be surprised to learn about you, personal or work related? I prefer personal.
Personal, okay. Well, I'm a vegetarian. You know that because we've been out at Mexican food restaurants and stuff. But I did this story in the early 90s. It started out as looking at the possibility that mad cow could spread through our food chain. And I started seeing these videos of these downer cows that were obviously sick, that were pulled into the process and ground up, and off it goes into some market somewhere. And the more I learned about how beef is produced, the less I wanted to eat it. I was a hardcore carnivore my whole life. I liked it. I would probably like it now, except how it is produced. You don't get this stuff off a hamburger tree. Yeah. It means that these animals have to die, and they're treated horribly in their lives. Pigs, it's even worse. They're never allowed to be pigs. You know, they're smart and they're sociable and they have senses of humor, and the life that they have, they're raised in these crates. They never get out of them. So I stopped eating red meat in 1993.
Wow.
And never looked back. It'd be a lot easier to start that now because you got Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, and these fake chicken things and that I eat a lot of. But back then, the thing is about being a vegetarian is I don't like vegetables, so it was hard. I don't.
We'll have to disguise them some way.
Yeah, well, a lot of beans and rice and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't preach to people. I don't tell anybody what they should eat. I don't want to be told what I can eat or shouldn't eat. But if people ask me about it, I'll tell them why I made that decision. I'm really glad I did. I'd probably be dead if I ate meat like I did in those days long ago.
Well, George, thank you. Just as someone who works with you, I really want our viewers to know how humble you are. You're a big deal internationally and also in Las Vegas. A lot of people respect you and your work. And I think, you know, in talking with other people, they know you for being fair. You're passionate about issues, but you're always fair. So I feel honored to do this with you. So thank you.
Thanks. It's fun.
Thanks for joining us.